I'm Joe Quinn and this is the SOTT Report. Today I want to talk about two hot topics: the TSA pat-downs and body scanners and the banking crisis in Ireland. So first, Ireland and the bailout. I'm not going to get into the economic details of how the banking system works, it's just too damn complicated, and deliberately so. But it's not hard to see what the final result is. It's the result that banks were set up to achieve in the first place. To use a hysterical war on terror catchphrase, you could say banks are like sleeper cells. Banks have always been about collecting public wealth, storing it and making money off it, right? But more importantly, they issue loans. They are essentially the dead weight that hangs around most people's necks for most of their lives. But over the past few years, a plan was put into operation to use the banks to essentially impoverish the population of any given country. That's what's happening right now in Ireland. And Ireland, being small, is a test case for the same shock therapy that will be administered to other nations later. So what we're talking about here is, and always has been, a silent war between the elite and the ordinary people of this world. Over the past, say, 10 years, banks all over the US and Europe have been pushing loans on people who really couldn't afford them. In Ireland, I know from personal experience that within a 10-year period, banks went from financially strip-searching loan applicants to aggressively trying to force loans down their necks. So the result was that millions of people took the offer of a large loan or a remortgage on their house. In Ireland, this was easily done because the economy was booming and house prices were ridiculously high. Middle-aged couples sitting in houses they had lived in for years and on which they had long since paid off the mortgage were urged to remortgage because of the alleged high value of their property. Many did, took the cash, spent it, and now they're saddled with the debt to the banks and their house is worth a third of what the bank said it was worth 5 years ago. But what were the banks doing with all those dodgy loans they were handing out? Here's the way it works. One bank packages all their loans together and sells them to another bank based on the expectation that they will be paid back with interest. The next bank adds on their loans and sells on to another bank at a higher price to get their cut, and the process continues from bank to bank and round it goes. As they circled the globe, massive alleged value was accrued on these piles of overinflated loans, shares, etc. Just to give you an idea, in 2009, the funny money value of these derivatives, as they're called, was $863 trillion. That's many times the actual value of the economic activity on the entire planet. Banks and financial institutions were combining them together and trading them with other banks around the world, and other banks around the world were doing the same with their dodgy loans. But as time went on, these loan packages were being passed around, it became increasingly obvious that a lot of them were really risky and not worth anything near to what they were being sold for. So the banks frantically tried to offload them until the whole thing inevitably came down in the subprime crisis of a few years ago. And the banks then had to go crying poverty to the government, and the government bailed them out with public funds. In Ireland's case, the problem is particularly bad because, cheered on by the banks and the government, the Irish people have spent the last 15 years accepting loans based on banks' recommendations that the Irish people were essentially rolling in it. In short, the banks and the government lied. What a surprise. They set the Irish people up to be saddled with debt that they knew was not backed by any real wealth, except, of course, the wealth that is your house, your car, your social welfare system, etc. So the banks held all these bad loans and the Irish government had to assume that debt and bail out the banks to the tune of €54 billion recently. But that wasn't enough to cover it, and there isn't enough money to finish the job. So the EU Central Bank and the IMF are called in for a loan, which comes with the small print that the EU and IMF are allowed to define Irish tax policy and essentially control the economy and therefore jobs and government spending on just about everything. Basically, the bill has been left at the door of the Irish taxpayer. But here's the problem. There is no bill. That was all funny money to begin with, remember? 864 trillion? So there's nothing to pay in monetary terms. What the IMF wants the Irish people to pay with is their quality of living, their jobs, their welfare, their schools, hospitals and everything else. It's austerity, which basically means squeezing the population and making them suffer in order to control them better. That is the entire point of this cooked up economic crisis. But if you want it in more simple terms, if you want a thought to take away, here's one. The Irish government has just bailed out the banks for all those bad loans they made and profited with public money. The Irish people, therefore, have paid the banks back. If the IMF and the EU is going to take control of the Irish economy and squeeze it further, then the Irish people should consider their personal debts null and void and should collectively refuse to pay back any loans they have outstanding with Irish banks. Why? Because they've paid already. 54 billion. That's 13,000 euros for every man, woman and child in the country. And there's another 90 billion loan coming from the EU and IMF that is going to have to be paid back by the Irish people as well. Failing that, we need mass public demonstrations and the replacement of the existing government with individuals who actually care about the people. It's been called the freedom grope and gate rape, among other things. And people in the US are understandably outraged that in that alleged land of freedom and democracy, ordinary citizens are being physically assaulted and scanned with potentially harmful radiation just so they can get on a plane. First of all, you gotta love the term they use, pat down. It used to be a pat down, but that all changed with the Knickerbomber episode last year. I wrote an article in that one that pretty much summed up what was going on. It's called The Underwear Bomber, Crushing Freedom with Phony Arab Terrorism. Do a Google search for Underwear Bomber and Crushing Freedom. So what was once a pat down is now more like an intrusive feel up. I mean, does this look anything like a pat down? So it's no surprise that there have been an increasing number of horror stories over the past weeks and months from people attempting to use an airport. Mothers having their children taken away from them for private searches, pregnant women having their breasts felt and others being arrested and prosecuted for the merest sign of protest or dissent at these humiliating pat-downs that take place in full public view. But what's the backstory on this? How did we get here, and so fast? Is it really about security? The answer is obviously an emphatic no. What it's really about is the US government, homeland security, money, and the desire to herd the population to a much finer order of control. Now, I'm not saying this as a result of some conspiracy theory. I'm saying this because that is what is happening. That is the result. Everyone knows that in the aftermath of 9/11, the Bush government and Congress passed a swathe of draconian legislation. Everything from the right to detain and imprison anyone they liked as enemy combatants or domestic terrorists, to wiretapping American households and accessing private information on any and all aspects of a US citizen's life. Leading the charge in the imposition of what amounts to the infrastructure of a police state is Michael Chertoff, a former Secretary of Homeland Security and currently chairman of the privately owned Chertoff Group. It was Chertoff, as Assistant Attorney General, who oversaw the first whitewashed 9/11 probe. It was Chertoff who okayed and then defended the detention of hundreds of what he called material witnesses of Arab descent, even though it would later be determined that not one of the people detained had anything to do with terrorism, and were in fact guilty of nothing more than minor immigration charges. It was Chertoff who oversaw the Department of Homeland Security's criminal negligence in the response to Hurricane Katrina. And it is the Chertoff Group today that is doing business with the main manufacturer of the airport body scanners. They're called Rapiscan, although I'm not sure if that's pronounced Rapiscan or Rapiscam. Incidentally, when Chertoff slipped quietly into private business, he took with him buddies from the NSA, CIA and Department of Homeland Security. In his own words, he's doing the same thing he was doing in government, but from the private side. That means unaccountable. So thanks largely to Chertoff, although he's obviously not doing anything that his former employer doesn't approve of, the enhanced security and body scanners have been slowly appearing in airports across the US for the past few years. But as I said, it was the Knickerbomber incident that really gave the US government and Chertoff the opportunity to promote them widely. Chertoff gave dozens of media interviews touting the need for the federal government to buy more full body scanners for airports. That's your tax money being used to buy these scanners and pay more TSA agents to aggressively fill you up at airports. Think about that. Then more recently we had the terrorist ink cartridge possible maybe sort of attack, maybe. There's a lot about that incident too that stinks to high heaven of a government orchestrated event. But perhaps the most telling was the fact that it happened within 3 days of senior figures in the British airline industry, including the chairman of British Airways, saying that Britain should stop kowtowing to excessive US airline security demands that he said were completely redundant. In response to that non-event, the Department of Homeland Security said that Americans, and I quote, could expect yet more security in and around air travel. As a precaution, DHS has taken a number of steps to enhance security. Some of these security measures will be visible while others will not, unquote. I mean, seriously, you couldn't make this stuff up, although someone obviously is. Before the deadly cartridge attack, there was a raft of terror alerts issued by Washington concerning a coordinated terror attack against Britain, France and Germany. In response, European intelligence agencies called them nonsensical, and the Pakistani High Commissioner to Britain, who is close to Pakistan's president, said that the Americans were deliberately exaggerating the threats for political gain. In this case, political gain was the justification to ramp up the bombing of Pakistani civilians. So the question is, if they can see it and publish it in the press, why can't every American see it too? By the way, the Afghan-Pakistan invasion and colonization and bombing thing, one reason and one reason only. Time's almost up here, in more ways than one. But before I go, I want to ask every American watching, but also everyone from any other nation, to stop for a moment and think about what you imagine a police state to look like, in practical terms. I want you to think what the loss of your freedoms might look like, in practical terms. Would it be your government claiming that it had the right to tap your phones and track your computer activities? Would it be your government issuing repeated and phony terror alerts to scare you into a state of compliance? Would it be your government clamping down on your freedom of movement and treating every citizen like a potential criminal? Would it involve the suppression of the right to protest against what are clearly excesses of government? Look around you. Your freedoms are being taken away from you right now. The only thing that stops you from seeing it clearly for what it is the plausible lie you are told for why the removal of those freedoms is necessary. The plausible lie you have been given is the terrorism threat. But if you look at that threat in close detail, you'll realize that it is manufactured, that it is a means to an end, and the end is the end of true justice and freedom and a world that is fit for normal human people to live in. It's the end of a world that the greatest president in US history, John F. Kennedy, tried to create. It's a world that he strove for, and for his efforts he was brutally murdered 47 years ago.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
Many of the people who murdered Kennedy are no longer alive, but make no mistake, their twisted ideology of a dark world of totalitarianism and effective slavery for every one of us lives on. Take a stand now. There may not be another chance. This is the SOTT Report. We'll be back next week.